My son-in-law left a voicemail. "Frank, you need to leave. We need our space." I just smiled. The next morning, I canceled every cosign, filed the eviction, and sold the house. When the sheriff arrived, they started screaming. My name is Frank Calloway. I'm 63 years old. I spent 31 years working as a structural engineer before I retired, mostly commercial and residential builds across Middle Tennessee. I know how structures work. I know how load-bearing walls distribute weight, how foundations behave under pressure, how a building can look completely sound from the outside while something critical is quietly failing inside. I spent my career understanding why things hold and why things collapse. I thought I understood people the same way. I built the house in Brentwood in 1997, not metaphorically. My brother Roy and I spent the better part of that summer pouring the foundation, framing the walls, laying the subflooring. We worked 6 days a week, and Roy's wife brought us sandwiches at noon and cold beer at 5. I had subcontractors for the electrical and the plumbing, but everything structural. I touched myself. The back patio I poured on a Friday in September with just Roy and a borrowed mixer. It's slightly uneven in the far left corner because Roy got into an argument with his brother-in-law on the phone and lost focus for about 45 seconds. I never told him that. My wife Linda picked out every fixture, every tile, every paint color in every room. She had strong opinions about all of it, especially grout. I didn't know there were that many varieties of grout or that a person could have genuine feelings about them, but Linda could and did, and she spent a Saturday afternoon in a tile showroom explaining the difference between unsanded and epoxy grout to a sales associate who had clearly not expected that level of engagement. I stood next to her holding paint swatches and pretending I could tell the difference between Swiss coffee and antique white. We moved in that October. Carla was 6. She named her bedroom the Pink Palace even though it was painted a very pale yellow, which Linda and I agreed was close enough. Carla has always seen things her own way. That part hasn't changed. We lived in that house for 22 years before Linda got sick. I want to tell you about Linda because I think you need to understand what that house meant before you can understand what happened in it later. Linda was a high school librarian for 28 years. She believed in long dinners and good books and calling people on their birthdays, even if you hadn't spoken in years. She believed that a house was only as warm as the effort you put into it, and she put in considerable effort. The Christmas decorations took 3 days. She kept a guest book in the front hall and asked everyone who visited to sign it, including the plumber and the woman who came to clean the carpets one year, both of whom seemed genuinely touched to be asked. When Carla left for college in 2011, it got quieter. Linda and I found our way into a different rhythm. Morning coffee on the back patio, Friday dinners at the Italian place on Franklin Road that we'd been going to since 1999, Saturday afternoons where one of us read while the other watched whatever game was on, sometimes both of us watching, sometimes me watching while Linda read and made observations about the characters in her book out loud like I was also reading it, which I wasn't, but after 20-something years I had gotten pretty good at following along. I started building models around 2014, started with a scale replica of a railroad bridge I'd worked on early in my career. By the time Linda got sick, I had 7 of them in my garage workshop, all built to 1/4-inch scale, lit from inside with LED strips I'd wired myself. Linda called them my tiny infrastructure, meaning both the models and me. Linda was diagnosed in January of 2019. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4. The oncologist was honest with us in the way that good doctors are when the news is the worst kind, giving us facts without decoration and staying in the room while we processed them. 3 months from diagnosis to the end. We had 12 weeks from that morning to the Tuesday afternoon in March, when Linda took her last breath with Carla on one side of her and me on the other, and the pale yellow curtains letting in the flat gray light that March afternoons specialize in. I'm not going to describe those 12 weeks in detail. There's a limit to what a person should have to revisit, and I've long since decided where mine is. What I will say is that Linda was herself until nearly the end. 2 weeks before she died, she told me she was worried about Carla. Not in the immediate sense, but in the long view. She said she'd seen something in Daniel she couldn't quite name and that it unsettled her. When I asked what she meant, she was quiet for a moment, the way she got when she was being precise. She said she thought he was the kind of person who found generosity in other people and mistook it for a resource. I didn't know what to do with that at the time. I do now. Carla was 31 when her mother died. She and Daniel had been married for a year and a half. They'd moved to Nashville from Memphis the year before, renting an apartment in Midtown while Daniel tried to get his contracting business established, and Carla worked at a marketing firm downtown. They were at the house when Linda died, and they stayed for a week after the funeral, which was right and necessary, and I was glad for Carla's presence in those strange early days of grief, even if I sometimes needed to be alone with it in a way I didn't know how to explain. After they left, I was alone in a 4-bedroom house in Brentwood that suddenly felt like it was made of echo. That's the only way I know how to describe it. Echo. Every room had Linda in it, and also didn't have Linda in it, and the combination was a kind of presence in itself. I learned to navigate it. Morning coffee on the back patio even in the cold months. Friday dinners at the Italian place, sitting at the same table, talking to the same waitress who had known us for 20 years and who cried the first time she saw me come in alone and squeezed my arm without saying anything, which was exactly the right thing. I kept the guest book in the front hall, and sometimes when I couldn't sleep, I'd go downstairs and read through through it. 6 months after Linda passed, Carla called. She and Daniel were struggling. The pandemic had hurt his contracting business. Her firm had cut salaries. They were behind on rent, and the landlord had started sending notices. Could they stay with me, just until things stabilized? I said yes without hesitating. She was my daughter. The house had 4 bedrooms and an empty kitchen and a back patio. I sat on alone every morning. I told her to come whenever they were ready. They arrived on a Saturday with a rented truck and 4 carloads of furniture. I helped them move in. Daniel and I carried his desk up the stairs together, and when we set it down in the guest room, he laughed and said, "Man, this is temporary, but it doesn't feel temporary." And I thought he meant it as a joke. That was 4 years before the voicemail. The first year was genuinely fine. I don't want to rewrite history in either direction. Daniel picked up work again, 3 or 4 steady contracts through the fall, and seemed to have some momentum. Carla worked from home. We got into a routine, the 3 of us. Coffee in the mornings, dinner together a few nights a week. There were evenings where I'd sit at the kitchen table after dinner, listening to Carla talk about her work, and think that having family around had softened something. The silence had been sharpening. The house felt like a house again instead of a monument, and that counted for something. The edges started showing in the second year. It started small, the way it always does with these things. One morning I came downstairs and the living room furniture had been rearranged. The couch had been moved from the south wall to the east wall facing the television, which I suppose made practical sense from a viewing angle perspective, but no one had mentioned they were planning to do it and I hadn't been asked. I stood in the doorway for a moment looking at the room and something small registered. Not quite discomfort, more like a slight vibration at a frequency I couldn't quite identify. I told myself it was just furniture. A week later, my coffee maker was gone. Not broken, not moved aside. Gone. In its place was a different machine, a sleek silver one that took pods, which was Daniel's preference. Mine was in the garage on the shelf next to my drill press. When I asked about it, Daniel said the pod machine was better and took up less counter space. I said okay and went to the garage to get mine. He said, "Oh, just use this one. I got the pods you like." I stood there in my own kitchen being redirected away from my own appliance, and I thought about the word just, how often it precedes a sentence designed to make a request seem smaller than it is. I brought the coffee maker back inside and put it on the counter. Daniel watched and didn't say anything further. That month, he started parking in the center of the driveway. Not every day at first, occasionally. But the pattern settled, and within a few weeks it was the default position. His truck centered, which meant I had to angle mine at an awkward diagonal to fit alongside it. There was plenty of room for 2 vehicles if he parked to one side. The driveway was poured 20 feet wide specifically so that 2 vehicles could fit comfortably. I had designed the pour that way. I knew the measurements because I had drawn them. Still, I said nothing. I pulled in at my angle and went about my day. None of these things were individually worth fighting about. I want to be fair about that. A man rearranges furniture and chooses a different coffee maker and parks slightly inconsiderately. These are not grievances you bring to your daughter. They're inconveniences. You absorb them, you move on, you assume a baseline of goodwill that smooths the small irritations out over time. That's what living with people requires. What I didn't account for was that these things weren't random. They were accumulating. Each one was a small survey of what I'd accept, and every time I accepted it without response, the next thing arrived a little larger. By year 2, the comments had started. Daniel had a friend over for dinner in October, a guy from his contracting circle, and at the kitchen table, Daniel said, loud enough that I was obviously meant to hear, that living with an old guy who was set in his ways was challenging. Brett laughed. Carla kept eating. I refilled my water glass and changed the subject. A few weeks later, Carla sat down with me at the kitchen table after dinner, just the 2 of us, and in a careful, reasonable voice told me I should start thinking about downsizing. The house was a lot to maintain at my age, she said. She'd been reading about communities for people in my situation, and some of them were really nice and had a lot of amenities. I looked at her for a moment. I was 62. I ran 4 miles 3 times a week. I had built the deck outside the window she was looking past while she talked. The word situation was doing a lot of work in her sentence, and we both knew it. I thanked her for the concern and said I felt fine about the house and changed the subject. I started paying closer attention. The pattern was clearer once I was looking for it. Daniel had stopped working by then in any meaningful sense. His contracting business was technically operational, but I watched a month go by without him going to a job site, then another. He had 2 clients by the end of year 2, and I'm not sure how much actual work he was doing for them. Most of his days were spent in the living room watching sports or in the backyard on his phone or making plans for business ventures he described in detail over dinner and then never mentioned again. A deck renovation company, a landscaping service. One month it was a food truck. He was good at describing things. Carla's salary was keeping them afloat. I knew this because she'd mentioned once that she'd been picking up extra projects to keep their finances stable, and I'd done the arithmetic from there. They weren't paying rent to me. They weren't contributing to utilities or groceries. One night at 2 in the morning, I sat at my workbench with a legal pad and did the math. 4 years of housing at market rate, utilities, groceries, the cost of things that wore out faster with 3 people in the house. The total came out somewhere north of $160,000. I stared at that number for a while. Then I folded the paper, put it in the drawer, and went to bed. I never brought it up. Last Thanksgiving was when the recliner disappeared. I came downstairs on the Thursday morning to find the living room rearranged again, more substantially this time. The couch in a new position, the side tables moved, the area rug shifted shifted, and my recliner gone. Not in another room, not moved to a corner. Gone from the house and in the garage, where I found it when I went to get a screwdriver that afternoon, sitting between the workbench and the wall with a stack of boxes pushed up against one arm. I went back inside and asked Daniel where the recliner was. He said the living room needed a fresh energy. He said it while standing in the kitchen pouring himself a cup of coffee from the pod machine, not looking at me, in the tone of someone delivering information about a decision that's been made and isn't really open for discussion. I stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the hall for a moment. I was standing in a room I had painted the year after we moved in and repainted 7 years later when Linda changed her mind about the color. I had rewired the outlets in that room one summer weekend when the inspector flagged them during a renovation review. My furniture, my walls, my house. And a 34-year-old man who had been living rent-free inside it for 3.5 years was telling me my chair needed to find different energy. I went to the garage. I sat in my recliner. I did not say a word. That night, I made a call. I called Gerald Watts, an attorney I'd been working with on property matters for about 15 years, going back to when I was buying investment properties before I retired. Gerald is a careful, methodical man who wears the same style of reading glasses he's worn since 1994 and who never says 2 words when one will do. I left him a message asking if he had time in the next week to do a review of my estate documents and property situation. He called back the next morning and we set a time. I want to explain why I made that call that night and not before. It wasn't the recliner itself. The recliner was a signal, the clearest one yet, but it wasn't the cause. What it was the moment I stopped hoping the situation was going to self-correct. I had been watching the terms of the arrangement shift incrementally for nearly 4 years and telling myself that patience was the appropriate response, that the situation would stabilize. The recliner moved to the garage was the moment I acknowledged, privately and without drama, that stability was not coming and that I needed to understand my options. Gerald and I met at his office on a Tuesday morning. I walked him through the last 3.5 years the way engineers describe structural problems. Here are the load-bearing elements. Here is the deterioration. Here are my questions about failure modes. Gerald listened, made notes, and then spent 40 minutes answering my questions with precision and economy of language. The property deed showed a single owner, me, 26 years, no transaction, no co-ownership filing, no legal instrument that had altered that. Every utility, every tax record, every insurance policy in my name alone. From a property law standpoint, Gerald said, they are guests, extended guests with some statutory tenant protections given duration of stay, requiring proper notice procedure. But guests, I asked about the loans. 2 years earlier, Daniel had needed a co-signer on a truck loan, $28,000. Carla had asked on his behalf. I had agreed. A year after that, an equipment loan, $11,500. I was on both as co-signer, total remaining balance around $31,000. Gerald said withdrawal was possible, but would require Daniel to qualify independently or find a replacement, which given his income history and current employment situation was unlikely. I told him to start the paperwork. About 3 weeks after that meeting, I started seeing Patricia. I want to tell you about Patricia because she matters to this story in ways that go beyond what she gets credited for. We met at a neighborhood association meeting in early November. I hadn't been to one in years, but the agenda included a drainage issue on my street that I had opinions about. Patricia was sitting 2 rows ahead of me and made an observation about the drainage proposal that was so technically accurate and delivered with such dry humor that I laughed out loud, which I don't do often in public. She turned around to see who'd laughed. We introduced ourselves. Patricia was 60 years old, recently retired after 30 years teaching high school English. She had the particular intelligence of someone who has spent decades genuinely listening to what people are actually saying rather than what they mean to say. She was not impressed by things, which is rare and valuable. She was interested in things, which is rarer and more valuable still. We had coffee twice, then dinner, then a walk along the greenway near her apartment that lasted 4 hours because we kept finding things to talk about. By December, I understood that this was something, and it felt, carefully and with appropriate caution, like something good. I told Carla about Patricia on a Sunday afternoon in December. I picked a quiet moment in the kitchen, just the 2 of us. Linda's good dishes put away in the cabinet above us. The particular stillness of a Sunday when the week hasn't started yet. I kept it simple. I said I'd been spending time with someone and thought it was going well, and I wanted her to know. Carla set down her coffee mug. She looked at me in a way that took a moment to read, and while I was reading it, Daniel came into the kitchen and Carla said, without looking away from me, Dad says he's seeing someone. Something passed between the 2 of them. One of those wordless communications that couples develop over time, quick and specific. Daniel leaned against the counter. Carla said, Dad. Her voice had shifted into a register I didn't recognize, or rather I recognized it from something but couldn't immediately place it. The careful, precise voice of someone delivering information they've decided on in advance. She said, I think you need to slow down. You're still grieving Mom. This sounds like it might be a rebound situation. Your mother has been gone 3 years, I said. 3 years isn't very long, she said. I sat with that for a moment. It's true that 3 years isn't long. It's also true that I am the person in this conversation who had been married to her mother for 34 years, and that the accounting of what constitutes long enough was not Carla's to do. I said I'd like to have Patricia over for dinner sometime. I said I thought they'd like her. Daniel Daniel set his coffee down. He said, "I'm not really comfortable with that." I looked at him. He said, "We live here too. We should have some say in who comes into our home." Our home. I need you to sit with that phrase for a moment because I did. Our home. 4 years ago, this man moved into my house with 2 rented truckloads of furniture and a contracting business going sideways. Since then, he had rearranged the furniture without asking, relocated my belongings to the garage, stopped contributing financially to the household, and spent most of his days watching television in a living room I had built. And at some point in that time, in the internal narrative he'd been maintaining, the word "our" had attached itself to the word "home." "This is my house, Daniel," I said. "We've built our life here, Frank. That has to count for something." I picked up my keys and told them I had errands. I drove to Patricia's apartment and sat in her kitchen for 2 hours. She listened the way she listens, completely and without interruption, and when I finished, she asked, "What are you going to do?" I said I didn't know yet. We both knew I did. I want to tell you about the weeks between that conversation and the voicemail. Nothing dramatic happened. The surface of things remained more or less intact. The hostility had been expressed and then submerged again, both sides continuing the routines of shared space while the underlying thing sat unaddressed, the way a crack in a foundation sits before the settlement shifts. Daniel was cool to me. Carla was careful. She asked about Patricia twice more in ways designed to seem casual. I gave neutral answers. I saw Patricia twice a week and didn't mention it at the house unless asked. I met with Gerald again in February to review the notice paperwork. It was ready. I held it in a folder in the drawer of my workbench next to the legal pad with the $160,000 number. I hadn't used either yet. I was still watching, calculating load. The voicemail arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in March. I was in the garage working on the bridge model. It's a covered bridge in Vermont, a historic one that Linda and I had visited on a driving trip we took for our 20th anniversary. We spent a night in a bed and breakfast near it and walked across it in the morning fog. Linda had taken a photograph of me standing in the middle of it, and the photo lived on the bookshelf in the bedroom until it moved with me. I started the model 8 months before the voicemail arrived, and it was about 60% complete by then. The main span and the roof line done, the siding in progress. My phone was on the edge of the workbench. It buzzed. I looked at the screen. Voicemail, no missed call. He had called directly to voicemail, which meant he had declined to risk the possibility that I might pick up. I pressed play. Daniel's voice, flat, businesslike. The specific flat business voice of a person who has rehearsed and decided that tone management is more important than content, which is always a tell. "Frank, this is Daniel. Just so you know, Carla and I have decided this arrangement isn't working anymore. You need to find somewhere else to live. We need our space." That was it. He hung up without waiting for a response. No comma at the end. No question. A period. I set the phone down on the workbench. I looked at the bridge model. I thought about what Linda had said in those last weeks, about people who mistake generosity for a resource. I thought about the word "our" and the word "home," and the specific flat voice of a man who had looked at the situation he was in and concluded that the person he was living with would absorb this the way he'd absorbed everything else. I sat there for about 10 minutes. The garage was quiet. The single bulb above the workbench lit the model and the tools and the legal pad in the drawer. Then I smiled. Not because it was funny, because I had finally been given the one thing I'd been waiting for without knowing I was waiting for it. Permission. Daniel had told me to leave. He had made the decision explicit. He had transferred the moral weight of what came next entirely onto himself, which is the only thing I can think of that explains why a man would do what he did in the way that he did it. He thought I'd absorb it. He'd been right so many times before that he'd forgotten to consider the alternative. I called Gerald at 7:30 p.m. He called back in 9 minutes. The next morning I was in his office at 8 a.m. We started with the cosigns. Gerald had already begun the withdrawal paperwork, but hadn't submitted it pending my decision. I told him to submit it. Both accounts that day. The truck loan and the equipment loan. $31,000 combined. He made a note. Then we talked through the eviction notice. I wanted to be accurate about my legal footing before I moved. Gerald confirmed everything he'd told me before. Sole ownership, 26 years, no co-ownership filing, no rental agreement, no legal instrument giving them any claim to the property. The statutory tenant protections from duration of stay would require me to follow proper notice procedure, which the certified 30-day notice satisfied. If they failed to vacate, we'd file with the county. He expected resolution in 2 to 3 weeks from filing, given the documentation. I told him to deliver the notice by the end of the week. Then I asked about selling the house. Gerald looked at me over his reading glasses. I had not mentioned this before. I said I'd been thinking about it, that the house had 4 years of a particular kind of memory accumulated in it now, and I wasn't sure I wanted to keep spending time inside that accumulation, that I'd been thinking about smaller properties in the area, something with workshop space, and that if I was going through the process of establishing my ownership of the property anyway, I might as well think about the next step. He said it was my house, and I could sell it whenever I chose. He said the comps in the Brentwood area were strong and had been for 3 years. I called my realtor from the parking lot of Gerald's office. Thursday, the eviction notice went out by certified mail. I watched the delivery confirmation on my phone. Daniel's name on the signature line. The timestamp was 10:42 in the morning. By 5 p.m. Thursday, I had 11 missed calls. I let all of them go to voicemail. I was at Patricia's apartment eating leftover pasta and reading the newspaper, which is one of the few things I do that Patricia finds genuinely inexplicable. remarkable about me, the physical newspaper, but I've been reading one since 1983, and I'm not stopping now. By Friday morning, I had 23 missed calls. Friday afternoon, I listed the house. 4 bedrooms, 2 full baths, approximately 2,400 square feet, the back patio with the slightly uneven corner that only I knew about, the deck off the master bedroom, mature landscaping, Brentwood School District. My realtor set the ask at $740,000 based on comparable sales in the neighborhood. She expected strong interest. She was right. That Friday evening, my phone rang, and it was Daniel and I picked up. His voice was different from the voicemail. The flat, businesslike quality was gone. What was there instead was a kind of pressurized agitation, the voice of a person who had expected a door to open and found a wall instead. "Frank, what is this letter?" "It's a 30-day notice to vacate or establish a rental agreement at current market rate," I said. "You can't be serious." The notice was prepared by my attorney and delivered by certified mail. "I assure you, it's serious. We live here. We have been here. You can't just..." The property deed shows one owner, Daniel. That's been true for 26 years, and it remains true today. You have 30 days to either begin paying market rate rent, which my attorney has set at $2,800 per month, or to find alternative housing. There was a silence. Then he said, "This is because of that woman. You're clearing us out because of that woman." I said, "This is because you left me a voicemail telling me to leave my own house. I'm choosing to respect that request." I hung up before he could answer. Carla called 4 hours later. I let her talk. I've learned that there are moments when the most useful thing is to let something finish before you respond to it, because people will tell you everything you need to know if you give them enough room. She said I was being vindictive. She said I was punishing her for falling in love. She said I had never liked Daniel, and this was proof. She said her mother would have been ashamed of me. I sat with that last one. It landed. I sat with it for about 40 seconds, which is roughly how long it took me to remember what Linda had said in those last weeks. The careful, precise words of a woman who had always been right about people. Some people mistake generosity for a resource. I thought about 4 years of meals and utilities and $160,000 of housing. I thought about the recliner in the garage. I thought about a voicemail delivered by a man who was too careful to risk me picking up. Linda would not have been ashamed of me. When Carla finished, I said, "I love you. I have loved you your entire life, and I will love you until the last day of mine. But I need you to hear something. Your husband left me a voicemail telling me to vacate the home I have owned for 26 years. Not a conversation, a voicemail. You did not call that night to apologize. You called tonight to defend him. That tells me what I need to know about where I stand. I hope that changes," I said. "But until it does, the 30-day notice stands." I hung up. The 2 weeks after the notice were strange. Gerald was in contact with the county about the filing timeline. The cosign withdrawals had been processed, and both lending institutions had sent Daniel formal notices that the accounts were under review, and full balances might become immediately due if he couldn't qualify independently or find replacement cosigners. He could not qualify independently. His income wasn't sufficient to carry $31,000 at any bank's standard metrics, and there was no one in his life with the credit and financial willingness to take that on for him. On day 22, I drove to the Brentwood house. I wasn't there to negotiate. I needed to retrieve some of Linda's things I'd left behind when I moved out. A box of her books that she'd kept on the shelf in the bedroom. Her grandmother's sewing basket, which Linda had kept on the window seat and which I should have taken with me when I left. A photograph of the two of us from our Alaska trip in 2011 that had lived on the bookshelf in the hallway for 12 years. Daniel answered the door. He looked like he hadn't been sleeping. There was a quality to his face that I'd seen before on structures under stress, the particular compressed tension of something holding itself together through effort rather than integrity. I said, "I'm here for some personal items. I'll be in and out in 20 minutes. He didn't move from the doorway immediately. Then he stepped aside. The house felt different. It was still my house, legally and factually, but something had shifted in the way it felt to be in it. I've thought about this since, and I think what had changed was not the house, but me. I'd stopped wanting it back. I found Linda's books and the sewing basket and the Alaska photograph, and I was in the hallway when Daniel appeared again. He said, "We can't find anything we can afford on short notice. 2-bedroom apartments in this area are going for $2,200, $2,400. We'd need first month, last month security deposit. We don't have that kind of cash accessible right now." I looked at him. "I know what apartments in this area cost," I said. "I own 4 of them." He blinked. I don't think he knew that. "You have 8 days left on the notice period," I said. "I suggest using them efficiently." I picked up Linda's sewing basket and walked out the front door. On the last day of the notice period, Gerald filed the eviction petition with Davidson County General Sessions Court. We had a hearing date within 2 weeks. They hired an attorney, a young guy from a firm that handles a lot of tenant advocacy work, which I respect in principle. He filed a continuance request citing hardship. The judge granted 1 additional week. I was not worried. The hearing was on a Tuesday morning in March. Gerald and I arrived 15 minutes early. Carla and Daniel arrived with their attorney 7 minutes before the session started. Carla was in a gray dress with her hair pulled back. Daniel was in a suit. They sat on the opposite side of the room. Carla looked at me once. I looked back. Neither of us offered anything to the other with that look. It was a neutral exchange of information. We were here. We both knew why. The judge was a man in his late 50s named Halliwell. He had the expression of someone who has heard enough variants of a particular story to have categorized this one in the first 45 seconds of reading the filing. Gerald presented our case in an organized binder, tabbed and labeled. The deed. 26 years of mortgage and tax payments in my name. The utility accounts, the certified delivery confirmation, the full accounting of unreimbursed housing costs. Engineers and attorneys both share a belief that organized documentation is the appropriate response to almost any problem, and Gerald's binder was a work of organized documentation. Their attorney argued hardship, argued that Carla had an implied right to remain in her family home, argued that the notice was retaliatory following a domestic disagreement. Gerald responded, there was no written agreement, there was no financial contribution to ownership. The notice followed proper legal procedure, and if the court wished to review the voicemail Daniel had left requesting that the property owner vacate the premises, he had a transcript and an audio file, both available. Their attorney had not known about the voicemail. Judge Hallowell asked Daniel directly whether he had left such a message. Daniel said, I was frustrated. It wasn't meant literally. The judge said, reviewing the transcript, you told the property owner to find somewhere else to live, and your argument is that the property owner should not be permitted to act on that request. Silence. The court finds in favor of the petitioner, the judge said. The respondents have 21 days to vacate the property. Failure to vacate will result in a writ of possession executed by the Davidson County Sheriff's Office. The gavel came down. Carla made a sound I recognized. It was the sound of a person whose world has reorganized itself in a way they were not prepared for, even though they'd had 21 days of notice and several months before that of clear evidence of where things were heading. She had believed, I think, that I would back down. I don't blame her for believing it. I had given her a lifetime of evidence suggesting that I absorbed things and continued forward. She had miscalculated the difference between patience and permission. Daniel's face went still. Not pale, not angry. Still, the performance was over. Outside on the courthouse steps in the thin March sunlight, Gerald shook my hand and asked, what now? I list the house, I said. The listing had actually been live for 11 days at that point. My realtor had moved fast and the interest had been immediate. 4 bedrooms, Brentwood School District, the market in good shape. I had 3 offers within 6 days. I accepted the highest, $762,000 cash buyer, close in 30 days. A couple from Atlanta with 2 kids and a dog, and a very detailed set of requirements about school districts and yard space and proximity to a good coffee shop. My realtor said they'd been searching for 8 months and knew exactly what they wanted when they saw it. They closed 3 days ahead of schedule. I want to tell you that I drove past the house on the day the Atlanta family moved in. It wasn't planned. I was on my way somewhere else and made a turn without quite deciding to. I slowed down at the end of the block. The moving truck was in the driveway. One of their kids, a girl of maybe 7 or 8, was writing something on the front step in sidewalk chalk, kneeling over it with the focused intensity of a child doing something that matters to her. I sat there for about a minute. Then I drove on. The cosign situation had continued to run in parallel. The truck was repossessed on a Thursday, the week after the hearing. The equipment loan followed 10 days after that. Daniel filed a complaint with the Better Business Bureau about one of the banks, which accomplished nothing. He called Gerald's office twice, both times incoherent enough that Gerald documented the calls as potential harassment and added them to the file. They didn't start packing until day 19 of the 21-day court-ordered period. The property management company did a walkthrough the afternoon of day 21. The report was not good. Interior doors damaged from repeated slamming, a fist-sized hole in the drywall of the master bedroom closet, gouges in the hardwood flooring in the hallway consistent with furniture being dragged rather than lifted, a cracked glass panel in the back patio door. Total repair costs came to $11,400. My deductible covered the first $2,000. The insurer pursued the remainder from Daniel. On the morning the sheriff was scheduled to come, I was parked across the street in my truck with a coffee. I didn't need to be there, but there was something in me that wanted to see it through to the end. The same impulse that makes an engineer want to stand at the site when the load test happens. The sheriff knocked at 9 o'clock. Daniel opened the door. He was in sweatpants and a gray t-shirt, and the compressed, sleepless quality I'd seen on day 22 was worse now, less contained. He looked at the officer. Then he looked across the street and found my truck. I don't know what he saw in my face from that distance. Probably not much. But he stood there in the doorway of a house he had inhabited for 4 years as if it were his, which it had never been, and I watched the specific moment that a particular story a person has been telling himself ends. It doesn't look the way you might imagine. It looks like stillness. It looks like a man in sweatpants in a doorway with nothing left to perform. Then from somewhere inside the house, Carla started screaming my name. She had a particular way of saying it when she was very young and very upset. Dad. One syllable, stretched into 2 by the force behind it. She used it when she was hurt, when she was furious, when the world had done something she hadn't consented to. She used it at 3 years old when she fell off her bicycle for the 4th time and decided that bicycles were a conspiracy against her. She used it at 17 when I told her she couldn't go to a concert 3 states away with people I didn't know. She used it now. I put the truck in drive. I drove away before she reached the door. I live now in a farmhouse outside of Nashville, about 5 miles past Leaper's Fork, a part of Middle Tennessee that Linda and I had always talked about retiring to. 2 bedrooms, a real workshop with proper ventilation and wall space for the models, a back porch that faces west across a ridge line of old growth trees that do interesting things with the light in the late afternoon. I moved in May May, 6 weeks after the house in Brentwood closed. The bridge model is finished. It hangs on the wall of the workshop above the workbench, lit from inside by the LED strip I wired into it the week I moved in. Every piece in place. The slight asymmetry in the second, bent from the north end that I had to compensate for by adjusting the lateral bracing. It doesn't show unless you know to look for it. Patricia comes on Wednesday evenings and on Saturdays. She has opinions about my workshop and has also been known to wander out there in the evenings and stand looking at the models in a way that makes me think she might be developing opinions about those too, which seems right. She still reads out loud sometimes, not to me specifically, just to the air, and I've gotten very good at following along. Carla called me about 6 weeks after the sheriff. She was calling from a number I didn't recognize, an Antioch area code. Her voice was different. Some of the architecture had gone out of it. The careful, deliberate quality that had been there for the last 2 years of our arrangement, the precision of someone who's been choosing their words for maximum effect, was quieter. What was there instead was something I recognized from when she was very young. Just her voice. Just Carla. She said, "It's me. We're in an apartment in Antioch." "It's fine," she said, as if I'd asked. Then she said, "Daniel lost the last 2 contracts after the truck was repossessed. He's looking for work." I said, "I see." She said, "I'm not calling to ask for anything." There was a pause, a long one. She said, "I've been thinking about what you said, about me not calling when he left that voicemail, about calling to defend him instead of calling to apologize to you. I've been thinking about it a lot." I started seeing a therapist and she says, Carla paused. She says some things about patterns that I'm still working through, but I wanted to say it. I should have called that night. I should have told him he was wrong, and I should have called you and told you I was sorry. I didn't. I don't fully understand why I didn't, but I know that I didn't, and I know that it wasn't right. I let that sit for a moment. I said, "Thank you. That means something." She said, "Are you okay? Are you happy?" I looked out the workshop window at the ridge line. A pair of red-tailed hawks were working a thermal somewhere above the tree line. Patricia's car was in the driveway. The bridge model was on the wall behind me, complete and lit and not going anywhere. I said, "I'm genuinely happy, for the first time in a long time." The silence that followed wasn't hostile. It was the particular quality of silence that means someone is sitting with something true they didn't expect to hear and don't quite know what to do with yet. She said, "I'm glad," and I believed her. We didn't make plans. We didn't promise calls or visits or any of the infrastructure of reconciliation. I told her she could reach me at this number when she was ready. She said, "Okay." We hung up. I stood in the workshop for a while after, thought about structural engineering, the way I always do when I'm trying to understand something human. A building that's been compromised doesn't always have to come down. Sometimes you can shore it up from the inside, reinforce the weak sections, build new load paths around the damage. You end up with something more honest than what was there before, not the original structure. Something new, something that knows where its weak points are, that has been tested under load and found out what it can actually carry. That's not a guarantee of anything. It's a possibility. What I know for certain is this. I spent 4 years shrinking myself to fit inside a situation that was slowly dismantling me. I made excuses for behavior I shouldn't have tolerated. I told myself I was being generous when a portion of it was simply conflict avoidance, the kind that wears generosity as a disguise. I waited too long. I know that. But I also know that when I finally stopped waiting, I stopped cleanly. I didn't rage. I didn't perform. I called my attorney. I pulled the paperwork from the drawer. I followed the process that a structural engineer follows when a load-bearing element has been compromised. Document everything, understand your actual options, act on what's true rather than what you wish were true, and don't be surprised when the structure that was relying on your continued tolerance fails to hold itself up without it. Daniel left me a voicemail telling me to disappear. He thought I would. He had 4 years of evidence that I absorbed things and continued forward without consequence to him. What he'd missed in all that time was that I'd been watching, documenting, keeping my name on every deed, keeping the legal pad in the drawer, keeping Gerald's number saved. He miscalculated one thing. He thought I was patient because I was weak. I was patient because I was an engineer, and engineers don't act until they understand the full load. I understood the full load on a Tuesday afternoon in March. I stood in my garage with my phone in my hand and my bridge model half finished on the workbench, and I smiled, and then I got to work.